My new boss fired me to save money, claiming an app could replace 15 years of loyalty. He never bothered to read my contract's fine print. When he tried to sue me later, I walked into the boardroom and legally destroyed his career. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The migraine had started somewhere behind my left eye around 9:00 a.m., a throbbing, rhythmic reminder that I was 55 years old and hadn't taken a proper vacation since the Obama administration. I was sitting at my desk, pressing the cool condensation of a water bottle against my temple, waiting for the ibuprofen to kick in. The office was humming with that low-level corporate drone, the clatter of keyboards, the distant whir of the copier, the muted conversations about weekend plans. It was the sound of stability, or so I thought. I had just returned from an emergency appointment with my cardiologist 2 hours prior. "Stress," he had said, looking at my chart with the disapproval of a parent. "Elena, your blood pressure is sitting in a range that usually precedes a stroke. You need to slow down." I had nodded, promised to take it easy, and then immediately driven back to the office because the Q3 renewal for the inexplicable monolithic entity known as Client 1 was due next week. Taking it easy wasn't in my job description. Being indispensable was. Then I smelled it, the scent of aggressive sandalwood and expensive dry cleaning. I didn't need to turn around to know that Julian Thorne was standing there. He had a habit of leaning against things he didn't own: my cubicle wall, the break room counter, the narrative of the company's success. Julian was the new vice president of sales, a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a laboratory dedicated to creating the perfect LinkedIn profile photo. "Elena," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it was a summons. I swiveled my chair, fighting the spike of pain in my head. Julian was wearing a suit that was too white, the kind of fabric that dared the world to spill coffee on it. He was smiling, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. It was a muscle contraction designed to disarm. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I was just reviewing the prep deck for the OmniCorp renewal. We need to discuss the key person rider before." He cut me off with a wave of his hand, a dismissive gesture that swatted away 15 years of my specialized knowledge like it was a gnat. "Sweetheart," he said. The word hung in the air, coated in a sugary slime. He knew I hated it. I had told him in our first meeting that my name was Elena, not sweetheart, not honey, and certainly not old guard. He used it because it was a power play, a way to remind me that despite my title as senior director, I was just a woman in a cubicle, and he was the man in the corner office. "Let's pause on the OmniCorp stuff," he continued, leaning in closer, invading my personal space. "We're pivoting. I've been looking at the numbers, and frankly, your little handshake diplomacy thing, it's cute. It really is. Very vintage." My stomach turned over. Vintage. "Inefficient," he corrected, his smile widening to show perfectly veneered teeth. "We're moving into a more scalable model. Automated touchpoints. AI-driven sentiment analysis. We need velocity, Elena. And frankly, your salary band is heavy. It's dragging down the department's EBITDA." I stared at him, the migraine suddenly forgotten, replaced by a cold, numbing shock. "Julian, my accounts represent 40% of this company's revenue. You can't automate trust. You can't put a sentiment analysis algorithm on a golf course with a CEO who's worried about his stock options." "Watch me," he whispered. "We're eliminating the senior director role, effective immediately. HR is waiting for you in the fishbowl." He checked his watch, a heavy platinum thing that probably cost more than my first car. "Translation, you're fired, Elena, but I'll do it with a grin so you think it's a compliment. We're graduating you." 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room everyone called the fishbowl because there was nowhere to hide. The HR representative, a young woman named Kayla who couldn't look me in the eye, slid a thick folder across the table. It moved with a dry hiss. "Severance information," she mumbled, staring at a point on the wall just above my left ear. "Cobra details, non-disparagement agreement. If you sign the exit form now, we can process your final check by Friday." I looked through the glass walls. I could see my desk. I could see the empty space where I had just been sitting. My computer monitor was already black. My badge, which I had worn on a lanyard around my neck for a decade and a half, was sitting on the table between us. It had been deactivated before I had even finished walking down the hallway. Kayla reached under the table and produced a canvas tote bag. It was beige, with the company logo screen-printed on the side in bright, cheerful orange. "A token of appreciation," she said, her voice sounding robotic, "for your service." I stared at the tote bag. It was cheap. I could see the loose threads on the handle. They were gutting 37 enterprise accounts, my life's work, with one lazy pen stroke, and they thought a $5 bag would patch over the wound. I felt a physical wave of nausea. It wasn't just the shock of the job loss. It was the sheer, brutal disregard for the human element. I had missed my niece's wedding for this company. I had worked from a hospital bed when I had pneumonia because a merger was finalizing. I had given them everything. And Julian Thorne, a man who had been here for 3 months, had decided I was an outdated line item in a spreadsheet. I picked up the pen to sign the acknowledgement of termination. My hand shook just once before I steadied it. I wasn't going to let them see me crumble. I wasn't going to give Julian the satisfaction of seeing tears. But as I signed my name, I felt something inside me fracture. It was a clean break, sharp and painful. The doctor had told me the stress was killing me, but as I looked at that tote bag, I realized he was wrong. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The walk back to my desk to collect my personal effects was a surreal, out-of-body experience. The office hadn't changed in the 20 minutes I had been in the fishbowl, but it felt entirely alien now. The lighting seemed harsher, the air thinner. I was a ghost haunting the hallways I had helped build. Kayla from HR shadowed me, hovering 3 feet behind like a prison guard escorting an inmate. I knew the protocol. She was there to ensure I didn't steal company property or sabotage the servers. The insult of it burned in my throat. I had written the original security protocols for this floor. I reached my cubicle and pulled a cardboard box from under the desk. I started packing slowly, methodically. I didn't sweep things into the box in a frenzy. I placed them. First, the framed photo of my late husband, Mark. He had been the one who told me to take this job 15 years ago. "You're a shark, Elle," he'd said. "Go show them." Next, my mug. Ceramic, chipped at the rim, reading World's Okayest Ants. Then, I reached for the binder. It was a heavy, 3-ring binder with a spine that had been reinforced with duct tape years ago. We called it the Lighthouse. It sat on the corner of my desk like a religious artifact. Inside that binder were 15 years of proprietary relationship maps. It contained the birthdays of every CEO's child, the anniversary dates of every CFO, the specific dietary restrictions of procurement officers in 3 different time zones. It held the renewal scripts I had developed, refined, and perfected. Scripts that turned angry clients into docile lambs and docile lambs into whales. I let my fingers brush the spine. This binder had been with me through 2 global recessions. It had survived the pandemic when we pivoted the entire business model over a weekend. It had been my companion on more red-eye flights than my optometrist wanted to know about. Julian had called this replaceable. He thought he could upload 15 years of emotional intelligence into a CRM database and have an AI chatbot spit out the same results. "You'll need to leave any work product," Kayla said softly from behind me. "The binder stays." I froze. My hand was resting on the cover. "This," I turned to look at her, "this is personal notes. It's my handwriting." Mr. Thorne specified that all client documentation, including physical notes, remains property of the company, she recited. She sounded apologetic but firm. I looked at the binder. Then I looked at the empty black screen of my computer monitor. Stuck to the bottom bezel of the monitor was a yellow sticky note. It had been there for so years the adhesive had turned into a permanent crust, and the yellow had faded to a pale cream. Check section 12C. I had written that note during a late-night contract review 5 years ago, after a different executive, a predecessor to Julian, had tried to cut me out of a commission deal I had closed. I had fought tooth and nail for a specific clause in my employment agreement, a clause I had drafted myself and forced legal to accept in a conference room no one remembered now. That clause was my quiet insurance policy. I smiled. It was a small, tight movement of my lips, but it felt like the first breath of fresh air I'd had all day. "Of course," I said to Kayla, "he can have the binder, he can have it all." I stepped back, leaving the lighthouse binder sitting right there on the desk. Let him have the paper. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He saw data, I saw leverage. But they had forgotten one crucial thing, I thought, the internal voice ringing clear and cold in my mind. "You can steal the map, but that doesn't mean you know how to sail the ship." I finished packing the box with my personal items. I slung the cheap canvas tote bag over my shoulder. "I'm ready," I said. We walked to the elevators. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. The younger account managers, the ones I had mentored, the ones whose mistakes I had fixed silently before management noticed, they all kept their heads down. They knew. The smell of fear in a corporate office is distinct. It smells like stale coffee and silence. As I walked through the lobby, the security guard, an older man named Henry, looked up from his console. He saw the box. He saw the tote bag. His face fell. "Ms. Vance," he asked, standing up, "you're not." "Moving on to better things, Henry," I lied, forcing a brightness into my voice I didn't feel. He gave me that half-sympathetic nod reserved for people who just lost their job but didn't deserve to. He knew who stayed late. He knew who learned the names of the cleaning staff. He knew who was the engine and who was just the hood ornament. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am," he said quietly. "Place won't run the same without you." "That's the plan, Henry," I whispered. I walked out the revolving doors and into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The city noise hit me. Traffic, sirens, life moving on without permission. I walked to my car, a sensible sedan parked in the B-lot. I put the box in the passenger seat. I threw the tote bag in the back. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The adrenaline was fading and the crash was coming. My hands started to tremble. The humiliation washed over me, the way Julian had looked at me like I was gum on his shoe. The way they had erased me in 10 minutes. But as I keyed the ignition, my eyes drifted to the empty passenger seat where the lighthouse binder should have been. I pictured Julian picking it up, flipping through it, laughing at my handwritten margins, and tossing it aside. He thought he had won. He thought winning was hearing himself talk louder than anyone else. My win would be quieter. It would be measured in paper cuts. It would be timed until he was standing in a boardroom wondering why the air felt so thin. I put the car in reverse. Section 12C, I didn't need to read it. I had memorized it. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, I knew that while they had taken my job, they had just handed me a loaded gun. To understand why the betrayal cut so deep, you have to understand the cost of the investment. I didn't just work there, I lived there. 10 years ago, when the market crashed and our stock price was trading for less than a cup of coffee, I was the one who flew to Chicago in a blizzard to keep the Midwest accounts from jumping ship. I sat in a terminal for 14 hours because the planes were grounded, sleeping on my briefcase, just to make a breakfast meeting that saved $3 million in annual recurring revenue. When my sister died 4 years ago, I took bereavement leave for exactly 2 days. 2 days. On the third day, I was on a Zoom call with the procurement team from a telecommunications giant, wearing a black blazer over my grief, negotiating a 5-year extension because I knew if I wasn't there, the deal would fall apart. The company didn't ask me to do that. Well, they didn't explicitly ask, but the culture demanded it. The silence demanded it. I had missed birthdays. I had missed anniversaries. I had sponsored my clients' kids' science fair projects out of my own pocket because corporate expense approval was too slow. I knew the names of their dogs. I knew which client was going through a divorce and needed a gentle touch, and which one was a bully who needed pushback to respect you. That was the job. It was a weaving of souls, a constant, exhausting act of empathy and strategy. And then there was Julian Thorne. Julian was the antithesis of everything I had built. He had been hired 3 months ago from a hyper-growth tech startup that had imploded, though he managed to spin that failure as a strategic exit on his resume. He was 40 years old but tried desperately to pass for 30. He wore sneakers with suits, not because he was athletic, but because he saw Mark Zuckerberg do it once. He spoke exclusively in buzzwords that sounded impressive but evaporated upon contact with reality. Synergy, touchpoints, scalability, frictionless onboarding. He was a man who viewed human relationships as inefficiencies. I remember our first one-on-one meeting. He hadn't asked me about my team. He hadn't asked about the clients. He had asked to see my dashboard. "I don't really use the standard dashboard, Julian," I had explained, pulling out the Lighthouse binder. "The CRM doesn't capture the nuance. For exam." The VP at Omnicorp hates email. If you email him, he assumes you're being lazy. You have to call him, but only between 8:00 and 8:15 a.m. Julian had looked at the binder with open disgust. "That's not scalable, Alina," he had said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, creating a steeple with his fingers. "If you get hit by a bus, that binder is useless. We need to digitize your brain." "You can't digitize a relationship," I had countered. "Everything is data," he had replied. "You're just hoarding it to make yourself feel special." That was the moment I knew he was dangerous. Not because he was smart, he wasn't particularly smart, but because he was arrogant and possessed the authority to destroy things he didn't understand. He began shadowing my calls, but not to learn. He was there to critique. He would message me privately during client presentations, "Speed it up. Too much small talk. Get to the upsell." He didn't see that the small talk about the client's daughter's college acceptance was the reason they were going to sign the upsell. He saw time wasted. He saw efficiency leaks. And then there was the greed. 2 weeks before the firing, I caught him staring at the commission reports. "You make more than the CFO," he had said, his voice tight. "I bring in more than the rest of the sales team combined," I had replied, not looking up from my screen. "It's an optically difficult number," he had muttered, "for a legacy employee." Legacy, that was his code word for old, for obsolete. He wanted my salary cap. He wanted to distribute my accounts to 3 junior associates who made a third of what I did, and pocket the difference in his departmental budget to show the board how much he had optimized costs. He was a hollow man in a white suit, a buzzword blender who thought he could perform open heart surgery with a chainsaw because he'd watched a YouTube video on anatomy. As I sat in my car, staring at the brick facade of the building I would never enter again, the image of his smirk burned into my retina. He thought he had cut out a tumor. He had no idea he had just cut the main artery. I put the car in gear. I wasn't going home to cry. I was going home to bake a pie. Peach bourbon, my grandmother's recipe. Baking required precision. It required following a recipe. And once the pie was in the oven, I was going to open my home safe. Because while Julian had my binder, I had the original contracts, and I knew exactly what Section 12C said. By the time my tote bag hit the passenger seat of my car, the adrenaline had faded into a cold, sharp clarity. I didn't drive recklessly. I obeyed every speed limit, signaled every turn, and parked in my driveway with the precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Inside my home office, a sanctuary of mahogany bookshelves and silence that I preferred to the open-plan chaos of corporate life, I set the box down. I didn't unpack it. Not yet. Instead, I walked to the wall safe hidden behind a framed map of the Paris metro. I spun the dial, left, right, left, click. Inside were the documents that Julian, in his infinite, scalable wisdom, had deemed irrelevant. He thought the power lay in the CRM database, in the cloud, in the company servers. He didn't understand that in high-stakes contract law, the power lives in the addendums. I pulled out a red accordion folder labeled contingencies. I sat at my desk, poured a glass of iced tea, and opened the file. The first document was my original employment agreement, signed 15 years ago and amended 5 times. I flipped to page 22. Section 12C. I ran my finger over the text. It was a dense paragraph, boring to the untrained eye, written in the dry, rhythmic language of liability. To me, it was poetry. In the event of involuntary termination without cause, any and all restrictive covenants, including but not limited to non-solicitation and non-competition clauses, shall immediately dissolve with respect to any account designated as employee-originated in Exhibit D. But that wasn't the weapon, that was just the shield. The weapon was the next sentence. Furthermore, should the company attempt to compel the employee's specific performance or continued service post-termination to retain said accounts, such action shall trigger a mandatory retroactive buyout of the employee-originated portfolio, calculated at 2.5 times the trailing 12-month revenue. I smiled. I had negotiated that clause during a hostile takeover attempt 6 years ago. The previous CEO had been desperate to keep me from walking, and I had told him, if I stay, I need to know you can't just toss me out once the stock stabilizes. He had signed it because he never thought they'd actually fire me. But there was more. I pulled out the second document, the Lighthouse Methodology Licensing Agreement. Julian had called my binder cute. He had called it vintage. He hadn't realized that the Lighthouse wasn't just a collection of notes. It was a proprietary relationship framework I had copyrighted 10 years ago. Every year, I licensed it to the company for a nominal fee of $1, included as a line item in my bonus structure. I looked at the date on the most recent license addendum. Expiration date, current fiscal year end or date of termination, whichever comes first. The moment Kayla had deactivated my badge, the company's license to use my relationship maps, my renewal scripts, and my proprietary client data had expired. Every time Julian opened that binder, every time he accessed the files on the shared drive I had created, he wasn't just doing his job. He was committing willful copyright infringement. I picked up my phone. It was time to start the clock. I didn't call the company, I called Sarah. Sarah was the operations manager, a woman who had started as my receptionist 12 years ago. She was invisible to men like Julian, just another pair of hands to process invoices, but she saw everything. Elena, her voice was a whisper. She was likely calling from the stairwell. Oh my God, is it true? Did he actually do it? He did, I said calmly. How is the mood over there? It's weird, Sarah said. He's walking around high-fiving people. He told the team you decided to retire early to spend more time with your garden. Elena, you live in a condo. You don't have a garden. I know, I said. Listen to me closely, Sarah. I need you to do absolutely nothing to help him. If he asks where a file is, you don't know. If he asks for a contact number, you can't find it. Can you do that for me? With pleasure, she hissed. He asked me to order him a standing desk while you were packing your box. The body wasn't even cold. Good, keep your head down. And Sarah, if he announces any client meetings, let me know. He's already scheduled one, she said. A transition and vision webinar for all 37 enterprise accounts. Thursday at 2:00 p.m. A webinar. I almost laughed out loud. He was going to address the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, people who were used to steak dinners and hand-delivered contracts, with a webinar. Perfect, I said. Let him speak. I hung up. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the mouse to find the cheese. It took exactly 48 hours for the bleeding to start. I spent those 2 days gardening, which, as Sarah noted, was difficult in a condo, so I mostly rearranged my potted succulents and aggressively pruned a bonsai tree. I also backed up my personal cloud, verifying that I had copies of every single key person writer my clients had signed. These writers were the third prong of my trident. My whales, the 3 largest accounts, had insisted on them. They stated simply, if Alina Vance is no longer the primary account lead, the client reserves the right to terminate this agreement for convenience, effective immediately, without penalty. Julian, in his rush to optimize the payroll, hadn't bothered to read the client contracts. He saw revenue streams, he didn't see the dam holding them back. Thursday afternoon rolled around. I didn't need a login to know how the webinar went. I could feel the disaster vibrating through the air. At 4:00 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. Train wreck. He used a generic slide deck, mispronounced the CEO of Omnicorp's last name twice, and he muted everyone so they couldn't ask questions. The chat box was spicy. I poured myself a glass of wine. The first domino was about to fall. It happened the next morning. I was in my kitchen, rolling out dough. Baking was my therapy. There is something profoundly satisfying about taking raw, messy ingredients and forcing them into a structure that yields a perfect result. As I sliced peaches for my grandmother's bourbon pie recipe, my email notification chimed on my personal laptop. It wasn't from the company. It was a blind carbon copy, BCC, from the General Counsel of Omnicorp, Client 1. Subject, Notice of Termination Service Agreement 8839. I wiped the flour from my hands and opened it. The email was addressed to Julian Thorne and the CEO, but the lawyer had BCC'd me. It was a courtesy, a nod of respect from one professional to another. Dear Mr. Thorne, we are in receipt of your notification regarding Ms. Vance's departure. We found your webinar yesterday to be illuminating regarding the new direction of your firm. Per Section 14.2 of our Master Services Agreement, Key Person Provision, please consider this formal notice that Omnicorp is exercising its right to terminate for convenience, effective immediately. We will be transitioning our business to a vendor that prioritizes continuity. Regards, Marcus Sterling, General Counsel. I read it twice. Illuminating. In legal speak, that was the equivalent of a slap across the face with a wet glove. That account alone was worth $12 million a year. Julian had just incinerated it in less than 48 hours. I felt a bubble of laughter rise in my chest. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was dark, jagged, and sharp. It was the gallows humor of watching someone burn down a barn to kill a spider. I went back to my pie. I arranged the lattice crust with excruciating care. When it came out of the oven, bubbling with golden syrup and smelling of victory, I whipped some heavy cream. I took a piping bag and, with the steady hand of a surgeon, wrote across the top of the pie, "Cost of doing business." I took a photo. I almost texted it to Julian. I hovered my thumb over the send button, imagining his face as he looked at his phone in the middle of the panic that must be consuming the office. But I didn't. That was petty. I wasn't being petty, I was being strategic. Silence is terrifying to a man like Julian. If I taunted him, he could label me a disgruntled ex-employee. If I stayed silent, I was a mystery, and mysteries are dangerous. I ate a slice of the pie. It tasted like justice. By Monday, the panic had set in. Sarah updated me in snippets. CEO is screaming. Julian is blaming market headwinds. They're trying to reach the Omnicorp contact, but no one will return their calls. Then the second shoe dropped. Client 2, a massive logistics firm I had courted for 7 years, sent their notice. Pursuant to Section 11B, terminating effective immediately due to key person change. They didn't even write a long letter, just 2 sentences. Cold, efficient, exactly the way I had taught them to be. That was another $8 million gone. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Hello," I answered, my voice pleasant, unbothered. "Elena, it's Marcus from OmniCorp." "Marcus," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I assume you're not calling to ask for my pie crust recipe." "Not today," he chuckled. "Look, off the record, we didn't leave because of the webinar. I mean, the webinar was garbage, but we left because the contract said we could. And because we know where the value lives. Where are you landing?" "I'm taking a beat, Marcus, assessing my options." "Well, assess faster," he said. "We have a hole in our Q4 strategy that looks exactly like you. And my CEO is asking why we're paying a vendor that fired the only person who knows how our business works." "Give me a week," I said. "You have 3 days," he replied, "before I have to put this out to formal bid." I hung up. The leverage was shifting. I wasn't just a fired employee anymore. I was a free agent with a portfolio of billions in tow. And that was when the antagonist finally realized he wasn't fighting a ghost. He was fighting a siege. The investigation phase of my plan shifted into active warfare on Tuesday. Client 3, the whale of all whales, a pharmaceutical giant with a contract so complex it required its own server, didn't send an email. They sent a courier. The termination notice arrived at the company headquarters in a physical envelope, delivered to the CEO's desk. Sarah told me about it later. The CEO turned purple. Actually purple. He threw the letter at Julian. I think I heard the word incompetence used at a volume that shook the glass walls. That was it, $27 million in annual revenue, gone in 4 business days. The stock price was going to wobble. The board was going to ask questions. And Julian, desperate to stop the bleeding, made his fatal mistake. He tried to fix it himself. According to Sarah, Julian spent the entire day frantically trying to access the Lighthouse files on the shared drive. He needed the relationship maps. He needed to know who to call, what to say, what the leverage points were. But he couldn't make sense of them. The files were encrypted with a logic only I possessed, referencing the hard copy binder I had left behind. So he used the scripts. He took my renewal framework. A document clearly marked proprietary license expired in the metadata, and he copied and pasted it into a mass email to the remaining clients. He didn't change the formatting. He didn't even remove the footer that said Vance Methodology Copyright 2014. I knew this because Client 4 forwarded it to me with a note. "Did you write this? It sounds like you, but dumber." I saved that email. I saved the attachment. I printed the metadata showing the timestamp. Then the company reached out. It started with the CEO's assistant, a woman named Jessica who had never spoken to me in 15 years without a tone of condescension. Subject: urgent transition materials. "Elena, we need the encryption keys for the Client 3 folder immediately. Also, please forward the most recent contact list for OmniCorp. The one on the drive seems outdated. No, how are you? No, sorry we fired you. Just a demand." I didn't reply. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Caller ID, the company. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, it rang again, and again. Final. Lie at 5:00 p.m., the CEO himself called. I picked up on the 4th ring. "Hello." "Elena," the CEO's voice barked. It was gravel and caffeine, the sound of a man who was used to bullying his way through problems. "We need to talk." "I'm afraid I'm busy making dinner, Richard," I said. "I don't work for you anymore. Remember, the scalable model." "Cut the crap," he snapped. "You sabotaged the files before you left. We can't access the historical data for the farmer account. That is destruction of company property. I can have a lawsuit on your doorstep by morning." I paused. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Richard," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming very precise. "I didn't sabotage anything. I left the files exactly as they were, but those files are built on the Lighthouse framework, which, as you know, is licensed software. The license expired when you terminated me." "That's company property," he shouted. "You built it on company time." "Check Section 12C, I said softy, "and Exhibit D, employee-originated methodology. We litigated this 5 years ago. I own the map, Richard. You just rented the compass." He went silent. I could hear him breathing. I could almost hear his brain rewinding 5 years, trying to remember a contract he had signed without reading, because he was too busy looking at his stock options. "You are required to assist in the transition," he ground out. "It's in the handbook." "My contract supersedes the handbook," I reminded him. "But if you want to discuss a transition, I'm open to a consultation." "Fine," he said immediately. "Come in tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. "No," I said. "Not a casual chat. A formal meeting. Boardroom A and Richard. I want general counsel present, and the HR director, and Julian." "Why do you need a lawyer?" he asked, suspicion leaking into his voice. "Because we're going to read the contract together," I said, "and I want to make sure someone in the room understands what the words mean." I hung up before he could object. The rest of the evening was spent in preparation. This wasn't going to be a negotiation. It was going to be an execution. I went to my closet. I bypassed the soft cardigans and the sensible slacks I had been wearing for my retirement. I reached for the back of the closet. I pulled out the navy blazer, the Armani one with the sharp shoulders, the war blazer. I paired it with a silk blouse that cost more than Julian's watch. I chose my jewelry carefully, just my wedding band and a simple diamond necklace. Nothing flashy, just quality. Then I prepared the documents. I took 3 pristine copies of my employment agreement. I took the printouts of the client termination letters. I took the logs Sarah had sent me showing Julian's access to the lighthouse files after my termination date. And finally, I prepared 2 envelopes. On the first, I wrote option A. On the second, I wrote option B. I placed them in my slim leather folio. I stood in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the tired, migraine-ridden employee who had been fired in a cubicle. She was a shark. She was the person who had built this company's revenue stream brick by brick, and she was about to remind them that when you pull out the foundation, the house doesn't just settle. It collapses. "Sweetheart," I whispered to the empty room, mimicking Julian's voice, "you have no idea what's coming." When I walked into boardroom A, the temperature felt a few degrees too cold. The way HVAC systems always seem to overcompensate in rooms where people make bad decisions they hope to blame on someone else. The cast was assembled, sitting around the long mahogany table like a tribunal that had suddenly realized they were the ones on trial. Richard, the CEO, sat at the head. His tie was slightly askew, and there was a paper coffee cup in front of him instead of his usual stainless steel tumbler, a small detail, but a telling one. It screamed of disruption to his routine. Julian was to his right, leaning back in his chair with that familiar, practiced smirk. He was trying to project confidence, but his foot was tapping a frantic rhythm against the leg of the table. He was wearing a different suit today, a charcoal gray, perhaps an attempt to look serious. It didn't work. He still looked like a tech bro crashing a funeral. Kayla from HR sat to the side, her lips pressed together so tightly they had turned white. She was shuffling papers she didn't need to shuffle. Every few seconds, she made a little throat-clearing sound I had learned to translate as, "We stepped in it, and I know it, but I'm not allowed to say it out loud." And then there was Robert, the general counsel. He was an older man, near retirement, with thick glasses and the weary demeanor of a lawyer who spends most of his time cleaning up messes made by executives who think they are smarter than the law. "Elena," Richard said, not standing up. "Have a seat." "I prefer to stand, Richard," I said pleasantly. I placed my leather folio on the table. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the wood was the only noise in the room. "We're here to discuss the transition of the enterprise accounts," Richard began, his voice projecting as if we were in a stadium rather than a glass-walled box. We need the encryption keys, and we need your cooperation to stop this hemorrhage of clients. We are prepared to offer you a consulting fee for 2 weeks of work." Julian chimed in, unable to help himself. "Generous, considering the circumstances. We could just sue you for data hostage-taking." I didn't look at Julian. I looked at Robert. "Robert," I said softly, "did they show you the termination letter?" Robert looked up, confused. I reviewed the standard exit agreement." "No," I corrected. "The specific notice of termination without cause. And did they show you my employment agreement? Specifically the addendum from 2019. Robert frowned. He looked at Richard. Richard looked away. "I have copies right here," I said. I unzipped the folio. The sound was like a zipper on a body bag. I slid 3 pristine, stapled documents across the table, one for Richard, one for Julian, and one for Robert. "Let's read it together," I said. "Please turn to page 22, section 12C. I reached into my blazer pocket and produced a small pack of yellow sticky flags. I placed one on the document in front of Robert, right next to the relevant paragraph. "Read it, Robert, out loud if you don't mind, for the record." Robert adjusted his glasses. He looked at the paper. At first, his eyes moved quickly, skimming. Then they stopped. His brow furrowed. He leaned in closer. His lips moved silently, reading the same line twice. The room was dead silent. Julian's foot stopped tapping. "In the event of involuntary termination without cause," Robert read, his voice gravelly and slow, "any attempt by the company to compel the employee's specific performance or continued service post-termination shall trigger a mandatory retroactive buyout of the employee-originated portfolio." He stopped. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide behind the thick lenses. "Keep going, Robert," I urged gently. "The calculation." "Calculated at 2.5 times the trailing 12-month revenue of said accounts," he finished. His voice was barely a whisper. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "That's standard boilerplate. It means nothing." "It's not boilerplate, Richard," I said, my voice ice cold. "I wrote it, and you signed it. And by calling me yesterday, by demanding I come in here to assist, you attempted to compel performance. You triggered the clause." I turned to the next page. "Now let's look at Exhibit D," I continued. "This lists the accounts defined as employee-originated. Client 1, Client 2, Client 3, the whales." I looked at Julian. His smirk was gone. He was staring at the document like it was written in alien hieroglyphics. "And finally," I said, pulling out a separate sheet of paper, the access log Sarah had sent me. "We have the matter of copyright infringement." I slid the log across the table to Robert. "The Lighthouse methodology is licensed software," I explained, speaking to the lawyer, ignoring the executives. "The license expired on my termination date. As you can see from these server logs, Julian here has accessed the proprietary files 43 times since Tuesday. He also distributed a copyrighted renewal script via mass email yesterday." I paused to let the weight of that settle. "That is 44 separate counts of willful infringement," I said. "Statutory damages for willful infringement can go up to $150,000 per instance, plus fee shifting. You pay my legal bills, Robert." Robert closed his eyes. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He knew. He was doing the math in his head right now. 3 accounts, $27 million in annual revenue, multiplied by 2.5, plus infringement damages. The number in his head was approaching 9 figures. "Oh my God," Robert whispered. "It wasn't blasphemy, it was arithmetic." "This is extortion," Julian shouted, standing up. "She's bluffing. The methodology belongs to the company. She built it here." "Sit down, Julian," Robert snapped. The venom in his voice was startling. "It's in the contract. Ownership remains with the employee. It's right here. Did you not read the file before you fired her?" Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Richard for help, but the CEO was staring at the buyout clause, his face draining of color. I didn't come here to negotiate, I said, my voice steady and calm. I came here to give you a choice. I reached into my folio again. I pulled out the 2 envelopes. I placed them on the table, side by side. Option A, I said, tapping the left envelope. You rehire me immediately as an external consultant. My rate is $1,500 an hour with a 200-hour minimum paid in advance. Julian resigns effective immediately. The company issues a public apology for administrative errors regarding my departure. We reinstate the lighthouse license at triple the previous rate. I looked at Julian. He looked sick. Option B, I said, tapping the thicker envelope on the right. I decline your offer to return. I accept the position currently waiting for me at your largest competitor. I take my clients with me. They've already terminated their contracts with you, so they are free agents. And you wire the buyout amount, plus the infringement settlement, to my account by 5:00 p.m. on Friday. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table, looming over them. The clock is ticking, gentlemen. Option A saves your reputation, but costs you your pride. Option B costs you a fortune and your biggest clients. Richard looked at option A, then he looked at option B, he looked at Julian, who was now slumped in his chair. A man who had brought a knife to a nuclear war. How much? Richard asked hoarsely. The total for option B. 72 million, Robert answered for me, his voice hollow. Give or take the legal fees. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a corporate empire cracking down the middle. We can't, Richard stammered. The board, they'll fire you, I finished for him. Probably. But if you choose option A, you might survive. You can blame the administrative error on the transition team. You can scapegoat Julian. I saw Julian's head snap up. He saw the look in Richard's eyes. It was the look of a drowning man spotting a stepping stone. Richard, Julian pleaded, you can't be serious. She's bluffing. She's not bluffing, you idiot, Richard roared, finally exploding. She has us in a vice. You fired the key person without checking the key person clause. Richard turned to me. He looked old, defeated. If we do option A, he said quietly, will you get the clients back? I can try, I said. Marcus at Omnicorp likes me, but it will cost you. Richard nodded slowly. He reached out and put his hand on option A. But then I smiled, a sad final smile. Actually, I said, pulling option A back just an inch, I think I've changed my mind. They froze. I looked at that tote bag you gave me, I said softly, and I realized something. I don't want to save you, Richard. I don't want to fix Julian's mess. I've spent 15 years fixing messes I didn't make. I slid option A off the table and back into my folio. I think I'll take option B, I said, but without the buyout. What? Robert asked, confused. I don't need the buyout, I said, because I'm not just taking the money, I'm taking the business. I pulled a final document from option B and slid it across the table. It wasn't a demand for payment. It was a photocopy of 3 signed contracts. Omnicorp, the logistics firm, the pharma giant. All signed with Vance Strategic Solutions, my new LLC, formed yesterday. They didn't just fire you, I said. They hired me, directly, no non-compete, remember? Section 12C dissolved it. You stole them, Julian whispered. No, Julian, I said, zipping up my folio. I didn't steal them. I earned them, over 15 years of birthdays and late nights and science fairs. You thought you could buy the relationship. You didn't realize you were just renting the introduction. I stood up. I smoothed my blazer. I'll expect a check for the copyright infringement by Friday, I said, or Robert knows what happens. Good luck with the scalable model. I turned and walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The silence behind me was loud enough. The fallout was swift, brutal, and public. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone was already buzzing with texts from Sarah. Security just escorted Julian out. He was crying, actually crying. I didn't stop to read them. I walked past the security desk. Henry, the guard, stood up as I approached. He looked at my sharp blazer, my confident stride, and the way I was holding my head high. "Good meeting, Ms. Vance," he asked with a knowing grin. "The best, Henry," I said. "I won't be seeing you again. Take care of yourself." "You too, ma'am. Go give him hell." 2 days later, the wire transfer for the copyright infringement settlement hit my account. It was a significant sum, enough to fund the startup costs of Vance Strategic Solutions for the next 5 years. They paid it without a fight. Robert, the general counsel, was smart enough to know when to cut a loss. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was the dinner I had the following Friday. I sat in a private booth at Le Bernardin, the table set for 4. Marcus from Omnicorp was there. The CFO of the logistics firm was there. And the VP of operations for the pharma giant was there. These were the whales, the people Julian had called data points. "To the new Venter," Marcus said, raising a glass of vintage champagne, "and to reading the fine print." "To Section 12C, I added, clinking my glass against his. We laughed. It wasn't the jagged, dark laughter of the boardroom. It was warm. It was the sound of relief. "I have to ask," the pharma VP said, leaning in, "what happened to the scalable model?" "I heard the board fired the CEO this morning," the logistics CFO replied. "Stock dropped 18% in 3 days. They're restructuring, going back to core values." "Too late," Marcus said, taking a sip. "They lost the heart of the business." I looked around the table. These weren't just contracts. They were people. I knew about Marcus's daughter's cello recital next week. I knew the CFO was worried about his elderly mother. I knew them. Julian was right about one thing: the business world was changing. AI was coming. Automation was useful. But he was wrong about the most fundamental truth of commerce. People buy from people. I had walked out of that glass fishbowl with nothing but a tote bag and a box of personal items. But I had walked away with everything that mattered. The Lighthouse binder was still sitting on my old desk, probably gathering dust in an empty office. I didn't need it anymore. I realized that I was the lighthouse. The binder was just the map. I was the light. And as I looked at my clients, my friends, raising a toast to my freedom, I knew the storm was over. The waters were calm. And for the first time in 15 years, I was the captain of my own ship.